I never expected the call, not after everything. But there it was, on a Wednesday morning in late September, just as the first bit of frost had crusted over the grass in North Tonawanda. My mother's voice, trembling in that practiced way of hers, telling me that my sister was getting married in June, that they needed help, that I was family, after all. It would have been funny if it didn't sting so bad. They had made it perfectly clear when I was 17 and eager, clutching my acceptance letter to Syracuse, that they had no intention of supporting a kid like me. My father's words, bad material, still echo, even now, some 2 decades and a business degree later. I put myself through college with my grandparents' help and 2 jobs that made me forget what it felt like to breathe. And now they needed 100 grand to throw Katie a wedding she couldn't afford. A wedding with live swans and a string quartet. They remember me then. Suddenly, I wasn't the family disappointment. I was the financial plan. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I just asked them gently, almost sweetly, if we were still a family who didn't believe in borrowing, the phrase they'd tossed at me when I needed a few thousand for tuition. The silence on the other end was all the answer I needed. What surprised me most wasn't their audacity. It was how little it hurt this time. The thing about building a life without a safety net is that you remember every bruise you took on the way up. I made it through college not because I was brilliant, but because I was stubborn. I delivered newspapers at 5 in the morning and cleaned bar floors until 2. Slept 3 hours a night, ate whatever I could microwave in a dorm room with faulty wiring, and watched kids whose parents wrote tuition checks complain about stress. But I never told my grandparents. They were proud people, gave me 5 grand from their retirement savings, and told me it was a family investment. They died believing I'd be something better than what I came from. I owed them that. So when I finally made something of myself, when the bank started calling me Mr. Langdon instead of the guy who overdraft, I held on to that pride. I never asked my parents for anything. Not when I bought my first car cash, not when I got promoted, not when I bought the little 2-bedroom place here in North Tonawanda. They didn't even come to see it. Said it was too far, 30 minutes. And yet last week, my mother asked if Katie and her fiancé could stay in my guest room for a few months while they saved for the wedding. As if all the years of silence were just static in the line. I almost said yes out of habit. Almost. I sat with the request for 3 days. Left the voicemail unanswered, didn't text back, just let the silence grow thick around me. And it did like moss, quiet clinging. I kept looking at the couch in my guest room, imagining my sister's fiancé sprawled across it in sweatpants, raiding my fridge, asking if I had any snacks. I thought about the time I asked for help with books my freshman year. $200. I called home, nervous, trying to sound casual. My father told me, flat out, that college was a choice I made alone, and that I needed to handle the consequences myself. Then he hung up. 3 months later, they sent Katie to Paris for a summer program in fashion immersion. So when the envelope came in the mail, the one with the return address, I recognized immediately. Mom's neat cursive, cornered in gilt. I didn't open it right away. I left it on the kitchen counter while I made coffee, while I paid my electric bill, while I watched the steam rise off the mug like it was trying to leave the room too. When I finally opened it, there was a formal wedding invitation inside. Cream cardstock, gold lettering, all very tasteful. At the bottom, scrawled in my mother's handwriting, "We're counting on you." It was the most honest thing she'd ever said. I almost threw the invitation out, not in anger, but in something quieter, deeper. A kind of emotional fatigue that sits in your chest like wet clothes, cold, heavy, impossible to ignore. But I didn't. I kept it. I let it sit there on the counter like it was daring me to care. The thing is, they didn't ask for the money directly. Not at first. They asked for support. They asked if I'd be willing to contribute. And then, after I didn't answer, the real number came. 100,000. I don't know what was worse, that they had the nerve to ask or that they truly believed I would say yes. I started sleeping with the TV on again, like I used to during finals week back in college. Background noise to drown out the silence of being on your own. But the quiet still found me, wrapped around me like a reminder. I thought about my grandfather, how he used to call me the mule, half joking, because I carried so much and never complained. He said that like it was a compliment. And maybe it was then, but I'm not a mule anymore. I'm a man in his 40s with a good job, no family of my own, and a house that echoes too much when the fridge cycles on. Sometimes I wonder if I got so good at surviving that I forgot how to live. I called the bank the next morning, not to transfer money, but to check my balance. Just to remind myself that I didn't need them, that I'd built this alone. Every dollar, every line of credit, every quiet night with a frozen pizza and a spreadsheet. That was all me. The account balance blinked on the screen, and for a second, I just stared at it. I could give them the money, and it wouldn't ruin me. That's what made it hurt. I could save them. Again. And they knew that. But I wouldn't. Because that wasn't love they were asking for. It was debt in disguise. And I'd already paid more than my share. I picked up the invitation, walked to the kitchen drawer, and slipped it in beside the takeout menus and expired coupons. Not thrown away. Not honored. Just put aside. I wasn't going to the wedding. And I wasn't going to explain why. A week after the envelope, Katie showed up at my house. No call, no warning. Just the sharp rap of knuckles on the glass of my front door and the familiar tilt of her head when I pulled the curtain aside. She was wearing a pale pink coat, the kind you buy when you want to look soft while delivering a blow. I let her in because I was raised to, because some part of me still responds to family like a knee-jerk reflex, even when it hurts. She looked around like she hadn't been there before, even though she had. Once. Years ago. She made a little noise about how cozy it was, which is code in our family for small. Then she launched into the pitch. Not a plea, a pitch. She told me about the venue, vineyards, and chandeliers. She talked about the guest list, the signature cocktails, the dress that needed last-minute alterations from a boutique in Manhattan. All of it said with this rehearsed humility, like she was embarrassed by her own extravagance. But she wasn't. Katie doesn't do shame. She's always had this talent for making selfishness look like sentiment. Then came the ask. She wanted a loan, though she said the word like it had quotation marks around it. Just enough to secure the final deposits, she explained. I could even consider a gift if I wanted. Her voice got softer, and then she said it. You're the only one who can help. That's when I realized something brutal. She hadn't come here to mend anything. Not a relationship. Not a memory. Not a wound. She came because she thought I still needed their approval. I didn't. I asked her if our parents knew she was here. She blinked and said yes, like it was the most natural thing in the world, that they'd suggested it, actually, that they thought it would mean more coming from her. I laughed. Not a cruel laugh. Just quiet. Flat. The kind that fills a room with something that isn't quite sound. Then I said something I hadn't planned. I told her about the first time I realized I was on my own. How I'd pawned my winter coat to afford an online textbook. How I'd eaten peanut butter from Spoon for 2 weeks and told my roommates I was doing a cleanse. How Mom had told me over the phone that I needed to learn how to hustle. Katie's face froze like she wanted to argue, but didn't know how. So I stood up, walked her to the door, and said I hope her wedding was beautiful. And then I locked it behind her. They didn't reach out again for a while. No calls, no texts, no envelopes. Just silence. And silence can be a relief until you realize it's not peace. It's just the absence of new wounds. You don't heal from silence. You just forget where the cuts are until someone brushes up against them again. That brush came 2 weeks later in the form of a group email from my mother. Subject line, family contributions, update. No greeting, no personal touch, just a spreadsheet attached and a polite note asking everyone to review the shared costs for the wedding. There was a line item labeled Jake, TBD, TBD, to be determined, as if I was a delayed check in the mail. I didn't respond. Not right away. I just sat there, staring at the screen, thinking about how many birthdays they missed while I was working graveyard shifts to keep a roof over my head. How many doctor's visits I went to alone because I didn't want to hear them say I was being dramatic. How they didn't even know I'd been hospitalized once during college because I hadn't told them, because I knew they wouldn't come. Then I opened a new email window and typed one sentence. I was under the impression we don't borrow on principle. No signature, no words, just truth. I hit send and shut my laptop like I was closing a door that should have been locked years ago. The call came early in the morning, one of those numbers you don't recognize but answer anyway, because something in your chest says you should. My grandmother, Dad's mom, had passed in her sleep. Peacefully, they said, as if that made her absence any lighter. She wasn't the kind of grandparent you confided in. Not like Grandpa Walter and Grandma Edna, who helped me through college, called me just to hear how classes were going, asked if I was eating enough. This grandmother, Louise, was distant. Formal. The kind of woman who sent cards with $20 bills and underlined words in her letters like they carried secret codes. But still, she was family. And that word still held weight, even after everything. The funeral was held 2 days later at a modest chapel just off Route 31 in Lockport. I hadn't been back there in years. Not since Katie's high school graduation. The drive was cold and quiet. The kind of gray morning that makes your hands grip the steering wheel tighter without realizing why. I parked farther down the lot than I had to, a small act of rebellion against proximity. I needed space. Not from the service, just from the people waiting inside. When I walked through the chapel doors, the air changed. It always does at funerals. Grief mixes with politeness, and you get this heavy stillness where nobody breathes too loud. Mom spotted me first. She stood near the guest book, dressed in navy, lips pressed into a line too thin to be called a smile. But she tried. She placed a hand on my forearm and said she was glad I came. The words were soft, rehearsed. They landed like a postcard with no return address. I nodded. Nothing more. Dad sat in the front row, folding and unfolding the program like it held instructions on how to be human. He didn't look up. Katie stood with her fiancé near the floral arrangement. She wore black, but with makeup too bright for mourning. Her eyes found mine for the briefest second, then flicked away like I was a stranger she wasn't ready to place. The service itself was short. Verses read with shaky voices, stories shared by people who hadn't seen Grandma Louise in months, but needed to be heard now. I didn't speak, didn't rise when they asked if anyone wanted to say a few words. My silence wasn't grief, it was clarity. I found myself watching them instead of the coffin. Watching how Mom reached for Dad's hand and missed. How Katie dabbed her eyes without a tear falling. How her fiancé checked his phone when he thought no one was looking. It hit me, hard and slow. They weren't cruel. They weren't scheming. They were just tired. Fragile in the way people get when the lies they built their lives on start to buckle. They'd spent years pretending their choices were noble, their priorities justified. But under the mourning clothes and polite nods, all I saw were people who'd spent too long believing their own excuses. And I didn't feel anger. Not anymore. What I felt was distance. Not the kind you bridge with a conversation or a holiday meal. The kind that settles like sediment, layer by layer, until you realize you've built a continent between yourself and the people who raised you. When the service ended, I walked past the casket, gave it one last nod, and didn't stop to speak to anyone on the way out. They watched me go, and I let them, because I didn't owe them my grief, and I sure as hell didn't owe them my time. After the funeral, I expected something. A message, maybe. Some awkward half-apology disguised as a family update. But nothing came. No, thanks for being there. No, sorry things are the way they are. Just more of the same polite distance we'd all agreed to without ever speaking it aloud. I went back to work the next day. Same office, same emails, same little victories no one claps for. I sat in a budget meeting pretending to care about quarterly projections, while inside, something was still. Not broken, just finished. Like a book closed mid-sentence and never picked up again. That weekend, I finally pulled out the old box from my hall closet. The one with college notebooks, photos, and letters, mostly from my grandparents. I hadn't opened it in years. I thought maybe there'd be comfort in their handwriting. I was right. Tucked between a water-stained syllabus and a postcard from Arizona was a note I'd almost forgotten about. Grandpa's writing, clear and deliberate. The people who let you down don't get to define your worth. Just that. No preamble. No sign-off. I sat with it for a long time. That night, I walked to the diner 2 blocks from my place. It's nothing fancy. Formica tables, a waitress who calls everyone Han, and coffee that tastes like burnt promises. But it's quiet. And mine. I brought a book. Didn't read it. Just kept it open while I watched the door. Part of me still hoping someone would walk in and say, "We were wrong. We miss you." But no one came. No one ever does. And somehow, that was the moment I stopped waiting. Not out of bitterness. Out of mercy. For myself. Because there's a point when the silence stops being punishment and becomes peace. A cold kind of peace, maybe. But peace all the same. Spring came late that year in North Tonawanda. The snow lingered like it didn't want to leave, crusted over sidewalks and rooftops well into April. I started walking in the mornings again. Not for exercise, not really. Just to move. To remind myself that I was still here. Still choosing. One morning, I passed a yard sale on Lincoln Avenue. The usual spread, children's clothes, dusty electronics, old board games missing half their pieces. But there was a table of books that stopped me. Not because of what was on it, but because of what it reminded me of. Back in college, I used to dream of opening a used bookstore. Something quiet. Brick walls, mismatched chairs, maybe a cat that liked to sleep in the sunbeam near the register. That dream got swallowed by life, by student loans, by practical choices, by the long, slow crawl toward stability. But I still think about it sometimes. That alternate version of me. Softer, less armored. I bought a copy of East of Eden for $1. Not because I needed it. I already had one. But because I remembered reading it at 19 in a laundromat, surrounded by strangers, and feeling less alone. When I got home, I placed the book on the shelf and found myself staring at the wall. At the photos still up there. Most were me alone, graduation, first apartment, the day I opened my business account. But in the corner was one of the whole family. Thanksgiving, maybe 12 years ago. I looked younger, tired but trying. Katie had her arm looped through mine like we were close. Like we were kids again. I didn't take the photo down. Didn't throw it out. Some things you keep. Not because they still mean what they used to, but because they remind you of the path you took getting here. The burns and blisters. The places you almost turned back. The version of you who still hoped. Sometimes the past doesn't need closure. It just needs to be set gently on a shelf. It came out of nowhere, like most things from my brother do. A text, late at night, long after I'd given up expecting anything meaningful from him. No preamble, no context, just, heard you're not coming to the wedding. That true. I stared at the screen for a long time, thumb hovering. I hadn't spoken to Eric in almost 3 years. He was always the kind of person who could disappear when things got hard and reappear just in time to take credit for something he didn't build. That was his gift, arriving at the finish line with no blisters. I didn't respond right away. I put the phone down and went to wash the dishes, let the warm water ground me. But the question hung there, sharp and pointless like a broken key in a lock. I finally texted back just 2 words. It is. What followed was predictable. He said it was petty to hold a grudge over the past. That family was family, and weddings were about unity, not old wounds. Then, without even a breath between, he asked if I could help offset some costs since Katie was so stressed. Like I'd just forgotten everything. I didn't even get angry. That surprised me. A younger version of me would have written paragraphs dissecting the hypocrisy, the entitlement. But this version? I just stared at the message, then locked my phone and went back to scrubbing the skillet. Because here's the thing. When someone shows you they only value you when you're useful, believe them. And Eric had made a career out of being comfortable at my expense. The next morning, I blocked his number. Not to punish him, to protect myself. And for the first time, I didn't feel guilty about it. Some things don't end with a bang or a breakdown. Sometimes they just stop. That's what happened with my family. There was no final blowout, no dramatic confrontation. Just a slow, steady unraveling. A pulled thread here, a silence there, until the whole thing wasn't a fabric anymore. Just a pile of pieces we all quietly agreed not to pick up. Katie got married. I saw the photos on someone else's Facebook. Vineyard sunset, gold-lit dance floor, a cake taller than most people in our bloodline. She looked happy. Maybe she was. Maybe pretending long enough makes it real. I didn't feel sad. Not the way you're supposed to when you miss something. It was more like walking past an old house and realizing the windows are dark and the yard's overgrown. Familiar, but no longer yours. You know, I'd keep walking. That was almost a year ago. I've built a quiet rhythm now. Mornings with coffee and a crossword, afternoons of work I care about, evenings that belong to no one but me. I started volunteering on Saturdays, just a few hours at the local literacy center. Nothing heroic, just grounding. Sometimes people ask if I'm close with my family. I say we're complicated, and they nod like they understand. But most people don't. Most people have no idea what it's like to grow up knowing your value is conditional. That you're only loved when you're useful. That you had to become someone to be tolerated. But I know, and I also know this. I'm not angry anymore. Not really. I'm just done. I don't carry them with me like I used to. Their voices don't echo in my head every time I make a choice. I don't measure my worth against their expectations. I live my life on my own terms in my own time. Sometimes I think about what forgiveness really is. If it's a door you open or a weight you set down. If it's something you give to others or a permission you grant yourself. Maybe it's just this. Sitting in a warm room with no one demanding anything from you. No roles to perform. No debt to repay. Just the sound of your own breath, steady and free. That, I think, is what freedom finally feels like.